There's a clay tablet in the British Museum's Mesopotamian collection that contains the oldest written words about visitors from the sky. Not a recording, a warning, pressed into wet clay approximately 5,100 years ago by a scribe in Uruk who believed he was preserving humanity's first memory of contact. The tablet is damaged, partially translated, filed under religious mythology. But the text doesn't read like myth, it reads like testimony. A dying man's final act of preservation before the knowledge disappeared. He connected 4 things modern scholars treat as separate: the first cities, kingship descended from heaven, the Anunnaki, and the flood that changed everything. I'm not asking you to believe what he wrote, I'm asking you to read it. Consider the math. Writing didn't exist anywhere on Earth before approximately 3,400 BCE. Then in Uruk, southern Mesopotamia, it appeared. Not gradually, not over centuries, within a few generations. The University of Pennsylvania Museum holds 327 Uruk period tablets in its collection. The Louvre holds another 156. The British Museum, the Pergamon Museum, the Iraq Museum in Baghdad. Thousands of clay fragments from the moment writing began. And what archaeologists confirmed decades ago is this: the people who created the world's first writing system were real. They lived in a real city, they worked in real temples. And some of what they wrote down doesn't match what we've been told they were recording. The city was Uruk. Modern excavations place it near Warqa in southern Iraq. At its peak around 3,100 BCE, Uruk housed between 40,000 and 80,000 people, making it the largest city on Earth. The Eanna Temple precinct alone covered 250,000 square feet. Archaeologists excavating the site between 1912 and 2001 documented 18 distinct occupation layers spanning more than 5,000 years. Not simple marks, not tally notations, fully developed pictographic writing representing objects, actions and concepts, barley, sheep, temples and gods. The scribes who created these tablets were professionals. Training to read and write in Uruk required years of apprenticeship in temple schools. Students copied standard lists of signs onto practice tablets, memorizing hundreds of symbols. The curriculum survives on clay. We know what they learned because they left their homework: sign lists for animals, plants, wooden objects, vessels, professions, and deities. The Sumerian scholar Samuel Noah Kramer identified these educational tablets in the 1940s. They're archived at Yale, Penn, and the Oriental Institute in Chicago. The scribes were trained systematically. They weren't inventing symbols randomly, they were inheriting a system. But here's the detail that creates problems for the standard narrative. If writing appeared suddenly in Uruk around 3400 BCE, and these scribes were trained in temple schools, who taught the first teachers? The tablets show a writing system already structured, already differentiated by category, already capable of recording abstract concepts. Not primitive attempts. A mature technology from the moment it appears in the archaeological record. The official explanation is cultural evolution. Writing developed from accounting tokens, small clay shapes representing goods, into impressed marks, into pictographs, into script. The process supposedly took generations, except the archaeological record shows the reverse. The earliest Uruk tablets aren't simple, they're complex. Later tablets, from the centuries after 3000 BCE, show the system simplifying, standardizing, becoming more efficient. The trajectory runs backward. An Uruk scribe working in 3100 BCE would have been approximately 20 to 40 years old when writing. If he learned the craft at age 10, he was taught by a master scribe born around 3140 BCE. That master was taught by someone born around 3180 BCE. 3 generations back, and you're at the edge of the pictographic horizon. The moment before writing existed in any form we can recognize, which means the knowledge transfer happened within living memory. The first scribes learned from someone, and whoever taught them already knew a system complex enough to record not just sheep and barley, but beings described as descending from the bright sky. Because that's what some of the tablets say. The archaeological consensus treats the religious content on Uruk tablets as mythology, temple records documenting ritual offerings to gods, the names of deities, the hierarchies of the pantheon, standard religious material from a civilization that built its entire culture around temple worship. And most of the tablets do record exactly that. Grain distributions, livestock counts, rations for workers, the ordinary bureaucracy of a city-state organized around agricultural surplus and centralized labor, but not all of them. Tablet W 20,274,9 from the Iana precinct, currently housed in the Pergamon Museum, contains pictographs for barley, emmer wheat, and temple. Standard accounting. But it also contains a symbol that appears on fewer than 40 known Uruk period tablets, a sign depicting a vessel or sky object above a figure with raised arms. The sign doesn't appear in later cuneiform standardizations. It vanishes from the written record after approximately 2900 BCE. Assyriologist Hans Nissen documented it in his 1993 study of archaic Uruk texts, noting that its meaning remains disputed and that it appears exclusively in contexts involving temple hierarchies and divine figures. Not grain storage, not worker rations, divine figures. Tablet W 9579, also from Iana, currently at the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin, shows the same pattern: ration lists, worker assignments, then a sequence of symbols linking the temple, the sky vessel sign, and a group of figures described with a term that later evolves into the Sumerian word for those who came down. Not gods in the generic sense, a specific category. The scribes who pressed these tablets into wet clay weren't primitive. They lived in a city with monumental architecture, organized labor systems, long-distance trade networks, and sophisticated astronomical knowledge. They knew how to build ziggurats, calculate grain yields, and predict seasonal flooding. They developed mathematics capable of land measurement and architectural planning. And they chose to use their new writing technology to record not just barley and sheep, but beings who taught kingship and descended from above. Here's what matters. The question isn't whether the scribes were capable of distinguishing reality from mythology. The question is what they thought they were recording when they impressed those symbols into wet clay. Because if writing began in Uruk between 3400 and 3000 BCE, and the oldest tablets already contain references to beings from the sky, then either these scribes invented a complex mythology the instant they learned to write, or they were writing down something older, something they were told, something passed down, something they believed needed to be preserved before it was forgotten, and that's where the timeline becomes impossible to ignore, because the Sumerian king list says exactly the same thing. In 1906, Hermann Hilprecht published the first translation of a cuneiform text that had been sitting in museum collections for decades. The document was called the Sumerian King List. Multiple copies exist. The Weld Blundell Prism at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, Tablet WB 62 at UC Berkeley, fragments at the Oriental Institute, the Louvre, the British Museum. All of them say the same thing, all of them begin the same way. Before the flood, kingship descended from heaven, not metaphorically, not as poetic language. The text is precise. In Eridu, Alulim became king and ruled for 28,800 years. Then Alalulgar ruled for 36,000 years. In Bad Tibira, 3 kings ruled consecutively for a combined 108,000 years. In Larak, 1 king ruled for 28,800 years. In Sippar, 1 king for 21,000 years. In Shurapak, 1 king for 18,600 years. 8 kings across 5 cities before the flood. Total combined reign, 241,200 years. Then the flood swept over. After the flood, kingship descended from heaven again. In Kish, 23 kings ruled for a combined 24,510 years, averaging approximately 1,065 years per reign. still impossible by modern standards, but exponentially shorter than the pre-flood figures. By the time the king list reaches the third dynasty of Ur, around 2100 BCE, reign lengths match historical records. Ur-Nammu ruled 18 years, Shulgi ruled 48 years, Amarsin ruled 9 years, normal human lifespans, verifiable against other contemporary sources. The official explanation is mythology. The pre-flood section represents a lost golden age, a time of divine rule before human civilization. The numbers are symbolic, not literal. Babylonian mathematics used base 60 calculations, and scholars have suggested the figures represent astronomical cycles or calendrical systems encoded into kingship mythology. The flood serves as a mythic reset point, dividing legendary time from historical time. Reasonable, except for one detail. Every surviving copy of the Sumerian king list contains the same pre-flood kings in the same order with the same reign lengths, not approximate numbers, exact figures, 28,800 years, not 28,000 or 30,000, 36,000 years, not 35,000 or 40,000. These aren't round symbolic numbers, they're precise multiples within a mathematical system, and the flood marker appears in the exact same position in every version, not as a vague catastrophe somewhere in the distant past, as a specific transition point between two kinds of kingship, which raises the question that makes cuneiform scholars uncomfortable. If this is pure mythology, why this level of numerical precision? Why would multiple scribes across multiple cities over multiple centuries preserve identical reign lengths down to the exact year for kings that supposedly never existed? And why does the transition from impossible to normal happen so abruptly at a single event? The king list wasn't the only text describing beings who ruled before the flood. The Anunnaki appear throughout Mesopotamian literature: Anu, the sky god; Enlil, god of wind and storm; Enki, god of water and wisdom; Inanna, goddess of love and war. Historical consensus treats them as the Sumerian pantheon, deities worshipped in temples, invoked in prayers, central to religious practice from approximately 4000 BCE through the first millennium BCE, standard theology, standard mythology, standard ancient religion, but the earliest descriptions don't match later mythology. In Uruk period texts and early Sumerian inscriptions, the Anunnaki aren't distant cosmic forces. They're described with specific locations, specific functions, and specific interactions with humanity. Enki taught irrigation and agriculture. Enlil granted kingship. Inanna established the practice of sacred marriage rituals. The texts describe them not as eternal beings who existed before creation, but as those who arrived, taught, organized, and then withdrew. Later, Akkadian and Babylonian versions transform them into purely divine figures, creators of the universe, judges of the dead, timeless powers existing from before time began, same deities, different grammar. The term Anunnaki itself means those who came from heaven to earth, not metaphorically. The cuneiform breaks down: Anu, heaven; Ki, earth; Anunnaki, those who from heaven to earth came. Early Sumerian cosmology doesn't treat this as symbolic, it treats it as descriptive. Consider what the Eridu Genesis says, one of the oldest flood narratives, preserved in fragmentary form on tablets, dating to approximately 1600 BCE, but referencing much older traditions. The text describes a time when cities had not been built, when humankind did not know grain or weaving, when the Anunnaki decided to create civilization. They chose 5 cities: Eridu, Bad Tibera, Larak, Sippar, Shuruppak, the same 5 cities listed in the pre-flood section of the king list. Not coincidence, pattern. The Atrahasis epic, composed around 1800 BCE in Old Babylonian, describes the Anunnaki differently than Eridu Genesis. In Atrahasis, they are cosmic laborers who rebel against the work of maintaining the universe, leading the god Enki to create humanity as a workforce. The story has been mythologized, abstracted, turned into a creation epic about divine conflict and human purpose. But beneath the mythology, fragments of the earlier tradition remain. The Anunnaki still descend, they still teach, and when humanity becomes too numerous and too loud, the gods still send the flood. By the time the Enuma Elish was composed around 1200 BCE, the Anunnaki have been fully transformed into abstract cosmic deities. No specific arrival, no specific teachings, no interaction with early cities. They exist as part of the divine order from the beginning of time. The story has been sanitized, made acceptable, turned into theology, but the Sumerian king list predates all of these texts, and it says something simpler and stranger. Before the flood, kingship descended from heaven. 8 kings ruled for impossibly long periods, then the flood swept over. After the flood, kingship descended again, but the reign lengths dropped exponentially. 2 kinds of kingship, 2 kinds of rulers. A dividing line marked by water. Here's what matters for this investigation. The same pattern appears in the Uruk scribe's tablet, the damaged fragment recovered from the Eanna precinct and currently stored in archival conditions away from public display. The tablet that predates the standardized mythologies. The text describes the founding of the first cities in the same order as the king list. It names the Anunnaki not as eternal gods, but as those who came from the bright sky. It connects their arrival to the teaching of kingship and the establishment of temple systems, and it ends with a warning. When the waters rose, they departed. Not metaphor, testimony, or at least that's what the scribe believed he was preserving. A memory passed down from elders who claimed to know what happened before writing existed, before cities existed, before kingship as an institution had been formalized into the system that every later civilization inherited. The timeline converges. Writing begins in Uruk between 3400 and 3000 BCE. The first cities are founded, the first temples are constructed, the first scribes record beings who taught kingship. The Sumerian king list documents pre-flood rulers with impossible lifespans, then a flood, then normal human reigns. The Anunnaki appear in the oldest texts as teachers and organizers, not cosmic creators. Later versions progressively mythologize the account, make it more religious, more abstract, more acceptable. Which version is closer to whatever actually happened? The oldest account that sounds like testimony, or the later versions that sound like theology? Here's the detail nobody discusses when they teach the Sumerian king list in undergraduate mythology courses. The language changes. In the oldest Sumerian texts, the Anunnaki are described with verbs of motion. They came, they descended, they arrived. The inscriptions from Uruk and Eridu use concrete spatial language, from the bright sky to the earth, between heaven and ground. By the time you reach Akkadian texts composed 1,000 years later, the language becomes abstract. The gods eternally exist. They create from nothing. They rule from before time. Same deities, different grammar. The earlier you go, the more the texts sound like someone describing events. The later you go, the more they sound like theology. Linguistic analysis of cuneiform evolution supports this pattern. Sumerian scholar Thorkild Jacobson noted it in his 1976 work on Mesopotamian religion. Early Sumerian treats divine action with the same verb structures used for human kings and historical figures. Later, Babylonian develops specialized religious vocabulary that removes the Anunnaki from physical space and historical time. The shift isn't accidental, it's systematic, as if each generation of scribes inherited a tradition that sounded too concrete, too specific, too much like testimony, and progressively rewrote it into something more acceptable as mythology. The Uruk scribe's tablet sits at the beginning of that process. Carbon dating of the clay places it between 3200 and 3000 BCE, before the Akkadian Empire, before Sumerian literature was standardized, before the king list was compiled into its familiar form. The text uses proto-cuneiform mixed with late pictographs, placing it at the exact transition point when writing was solidifying from images into phonetic script. and what it describes doesn't match the later theological versions. The tablet's content is fragmentary. Damage to the upper left quadrant has erased approximately 30% of the text, but what survives is specific. It names 5 cities in the same order as the king list. It describes the Anunnaki with the concrete spatial verbs that disappear from later texts. It connects their presence to the establishment of kingship and temple hierarchies, and it includes a phrase that appears nowhere else in the known corpus of Mesopotamian literature. They departed when the waters rose, and kingship became ours alone, not divine punishment, not cosmic reset. A transition. They left. Kingship remained, but it changed, from something granted by those who came from the sky to something managed by ordinary human rulers with ordinary human lifespans. The scribe who pressed this into wet clay in Uruk around 3100 BCE had a name. We don't know it because the name section is damaged, but we know other things. He was trained in the Eanna Temple School because the tablet uses standardized sign forms taught in that institution. He was probably between 25 and 45 years old, because temple scribes typically worked during those decades before transitioning to teaching or administrative roles, and he was using one of his final tablets to record something he believed would be forgotten, because the clay analysis reveals something unusual. The tablet wasn't discarded in a trash pit like administrative documents. It was deliberately buried in a sealed chamber beneath the temple precinct floor. Not hidden, preserved. Someone wanted this specific text to survive even when the surrounding structures collapsed or were rebuilt, and it did survive, fired hard by time and pressure until German archaeologists excavating the Eanna precinct in 1928 found it 17 feet below the surface intact except for the corner damage. Imagine him in Uruk in the final years of the 4th millennium BCE. The city is alive with construction. The White Temple is being expanded. The Great Court is being paved. Trade caravans arrive from the Persian Gulf carrying lapis lazuli, copper and timber. The scribal school trains new apprentices every season. Writing is everywhere now. No longer a specialized mystery, a practical technology used by merchants and administrators across the city, and he knows something they don't know. The elders told him. Not his immediate teachers, but the generation before them. Old men who learned from older men who claimed to remember the time before the cities, before the temples, before kingship existed as an institution. They told him about the ones who came from the sky, who taught irrigation and agriculture, who established the practice of centralized grain storage and labor organization, who installed the first kings and taught them how to rule, and who left when the waters rose, taking their impossible lifespans with them. He's the last scribe who heard those stories directly. His teachers are dead. The elders who taught them are decades gone. The generation after him will learn from standardized texts, copied exercises, official temple mythology. They'll be taught that the Anunnaki are eternal gods who created the universe, not beings who arrived, taught, and departed. The concrete memory is slipping into abstraction, becoming theology, becoming acceptable. So he takes wet clay and presses the warning into it. These 4 things were connected: the founding of the cities, the descent of kingship from heaven, the presence of the Anunnaki, the flood that changed everything. Remember them together. Don't let them become separate myths. Then he buries it beneath the temple floor. He died sometime in the next few decades. Everyone who heard the elders' testimony died. The generation that remembered a different version of the story disappeared, and for 5,000 years the clay sat in darkness, preserving exactly what the last witness chose to preserve before the knowledge could be sanitized into theology. Modern archaeology treats the tablet as fragmentary religious material. The museum catalogue lists it as proto-cuneiform mythological inscription, early 3rd millennium BCE. The few scholars who've examined it note the unusual verb structures and the spatial language, but interpret it within the framework of Mesopotamian religion. Gods descending from heaven is standard theology. The flood is the standard reset myth. The connection to kingship is standard divine mandate ideology. But the scribe wasn't writing theology. The grammar is wrong for that. He was writing testimony, or at the very least, he was preserving what he believed was testimony passed down from people who claimed to witness something that later generations could only explain as divine intervention. Did Sumerian priests describe gods and myths, or were they preserving a distorted memory of an encounter their ancestors couldn't fully process? Did beings actually descend from the sky, teach civilization, and depart when floodwaters rose across Mesopotamia sometime before 3000 BCE? Or did early humans invent elaborate origin stories to explain the sudden emergence of urban civilization in the Uruk period? The tablet doesn't answer those questions. It just sits in archival storage, climate-controlled and rarely examined, saying the same thing it's been saying for 5 millennia. We came. We taught. The waters rose. We left. Remember. The clay remembers even when we choose not to. The archive preserves what the encyclopedias erased. And somewhere in that damaged fragment pressed by a dying scribe who believed he was the last guardian of an impossible memory, the truth is preserved the same way it's been preserved for 5,000 years, waiting for someone willing to read what the first writers actually wrote instead of what we've decided they must have meant.